nice to have this opportunity, I think, for everyone to share their ideas from sort of different perspectives. So there's quite a lot of you from all the South American countries and lots of you from Eastern Europe as well. So you really are thousands of miles apart, but of course we all have the same interests, don't we? So obviously, as you know, what we're going to be talking about today um, is we're very much focusing on assessing speaking and writing. And the reason we've chosen to focus on that is because lots of teachers say to us that this is something that they really struggle with, or, you know, they feel they would like to get much better at, because often with reading and listening assessments, we have objective marks and it's relatively easy to assess. But sometimes it can be much more difficult with speaking and writing, because often it's always slightly subjective. Perhaps we're not sure exactly how to measure the criteria we're given, or what is the most important thing we're supposed to be focusing on. And of course, this may vary when your students are also trying to do international exams like the Young Learners exams. You know, you want to be sure that you're helping them in the classroom with things that the actual test focuses on. So what we are going to do today is we're going to go round in a kind of circle, actually. We're going to start thinking about our young learners, the test takers, and the kind of sort of challenges that they face when they are being assessed on speaking and writing. What do they feel about this? And so, having sort of had a look at those, we'll then look at ideas for the classroom for how we can support our learners in managing those challenges. So either they stop being challenges, or they at least learn to feel more comfortable when they're about to go into one of these sort of rather scary tests. And then we're going to move on and start thinking about us as teachers. When we give our students a speaking or writing task, what are the key features of their performance that we should be interested in? What are we looking for evidence of, and why? And then we'll take those features, the assessment criteria, and to have a look at how we can actually perhaps start with these assessment criteria rather than just the task, and help our young learners prepare for the tests. So, you know, how can we come at it from a different dimension or a different angle, if you like? And then finally, we're going to come right back round to the learners again. And I want to talk a bit about how we manage feedback to help our learners, because I think this is something we could perhaps all have a bit of help with and pay a bit more attention to, so that when we're giving feedback, it's actually a proper part of the learning process, has an impact on their progression. So let's make a start with the first point there, which is something I'm actually going to ask you about. So let's think about our students. When they're doing not a test, when they're doing a speaking or a writing test, which involves them performing the language, what do we think they get nervous about? Do you just want to write something in the chat box, your ideas, some notes that we can all share and look across? What do you think the students get nervous about when they're doing a speaking or a writing task? What worries them, do you think? People are starting to type lots of ideas there. A nervousness, obviously, but let's have a think about why they're nervous as well. Okay, a lot of what you're saying there is you have some additional thoughts about it, and some nice sort of interesting ideas there. A lot of you are saying what they're worried about are mistakes. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. let's stop the typing in the chat box now, and I'll just tell you what I think some of the key things are that they're nervous about, and then we can think about how we can work around that. So I think one of the very first things that makes them nervous is, especially in the speaking exams, obviously we think what is being assessed is language. But when you speak, what you say is so closely associated with your identity that the poor students tend to think that this is about them performing as themselves, and they worry that they're being in some way assessed on themselves as a person and not their language. And it becomes very worrying when they think they have to have certain behavior rather than knowledge to do the performance. So this is one thing that can make them very nervous, and I think a couple of you have mentioned that. Another thing in a speaking and writing exam is timing. Obviously, there's a limit. They've got a limited amount of time to reply or to write things down. But again, they are performing the actual language skill, and this can make them feel really put on the spot and tense. And sometimes they can freeze because they're worried about, they get into a panic about how little time they've got to express what they want to express, because they know that there's a limit. And one of the important things that's going to thread through what we're talking about today is most students in general, but young learners in particular, there's a lot of uncertainty in them about how they're being judged. They don't really know what they're being assessed on. And of course, as a lot of you have sort of noted here, they tend to think, oh, it's about my mistakes. I must be accurate. It's about my mistakes. And so again, sometimes they're silent or they write very little because they're worried about making a mistake. But in fact, we can see, certainly increasingly in the communicative exams, that's not the focus of what they're being assessed on. So that they're actually not completely clear on what they're being assessed on. So that's always worrying if you're judged, but you don't know how you're being judged. And then something also I want to look at. So we've looked at what they're worried about their performance. But also they're worried about the task as well. So let's have a look at what things they worry about in the actual tasks. So one of the issues with speaking and writing tasks that they're given in an exam is it sometimes looks as if it's very free or open or vague. There's not a sort of single answer. It's not correct or incorrect. And that can actually give them a sense of panic, because obviously when we're designing the test, we say, oh, look, we're going to give them this opportunity to say what they want. But how the student can often respond is saying, well, that's really scary because I don't know what you're expecting me to say. And of course, the other thing they worry about is speaking and writing exams are sort of almost inevitably integrated, in that they have to listen to an examiner, or they have to read a task, and they have to understand it. And sometimes they can panic, even if they have understood, that they haven't understood, or they worry about not understanding. So basically, this is how our poor students are thinking. There's one of our little boys there, and he's thinking, what does the examiner want? What does she want me to do? So they forget that this is just a conversation. They think, what do you want? And do I know that? And sometimes students, they know exactly what to say, or what they would say in their own language, their first language, but they worry about whether that's still true for what they can say in the exam in a second language. Is that also possible? They don't know that they can transfer. And the classic thing that students always think is, what's the right answer? So even in these sort of performance exams, which are communicative, they think there's a right answer, and they say, what's the right answer? And if they worry they don't get the right answer, that's when they go silent and they don't produce. So let's have a think. So we've said those are the challenges they face. So let's have a think now about how, as teachers, we can help them with some of those challenges. And some of these we touched on in the last webinar I did, if any of you attended that. But let's look at them from a slightly different angle and perhaps in more detail now. So one of the very first things in terms of helping them with the things we've seen they're worried about is giving them reassurance by giving them information about the expectations of the exam. Now, I don't necessarily mean reassurance where you say, oh, don't worry, you'll be fine, it'll be okay. Of course we say that, but that's not what I mean here. And I also don't mean by expectations, I don't just mean the format of the exam. Obviously, we tell them what to expect in terms of first you'll be asked about this, then you'll be asked about this, then there's this task. I mean that we should discuss with them, or talk to them, or do activities around what is expected of them. So not just what can they expect to meet in the exam, but what is expected of them, because that's what will really reassure them. If they go in thinking, I know what's expected of me, I know the standard or whatever. So let's look at how we can help with that with some class activities. So one of the first areas, and I'm going to move on to look at some examples here, but I just want to talk through the main ideas at the moment. So one of the first things is I think we need to make sure, especially for today's modern exams, as I say, if you're doing international exams, that we always prioritize communications over language. Now, the reason I say this is we might be doing what we think are communicative activities in class, but what we tend to do is comment on their language at the end and not on whether or not there's been some communication. It doesn't necessarily have to be 100% or complete or successful, but we don't highlight enough for them. We don't flag or prioritize for them the fact that the communication is important. And I wonder if this is why some of them are so concerned about mistakes, because that tends to be what we pick up on. So one idea is to make sure that when you're giving your students communicative tasks, that when you're assessing them or giving them feedback, that you make sure you focus on successful communication. Another aspect is to make your learners aware of what they can do in their own language, as we've said, and how they can transfer that, so that they realize that, especially with speaking and writing, which are communicative skills, that they're not being asked to do something weird and wonderful and strange because it's the test. They're asked to do things which are relatively real life, which connect with the way they would manage those things in their own language, whether that's asking somebody to repeat something or whether it's how you get your ideas. And again, we're going to look at some examples from this. Another thing which I'm sure you all do, but I want to emphasize the importance of in terms of helping them meet challenges, is allowing them to collaborate on tasks before they do them. So whether this is in pairs or groups or however you want to do it, make sure they have an opportunity to do some collaborative preparation. And if you do this, what that means is they are given a safe space for their ideas. So you take away this panic and they're given this safe space, and it's not just dependent on them because they've got partners to help them. And over time, if you do this enough, it can make them much more confident. They eventually build up confidence in their own ideas. And of course, they learn from each other. And the last one, which we have discussed before, which again I'm sure you do, but let's look at it, is make sure that the students, when they're doing these actual tasks, have a chance to think about how well they did the task or where could they do it better, to really have some time to think about what they've done and how they've performed, and also that they're given an opportunity to improve by repeating what they've done. So let's just have, I'm just going to go through some examples which actually we've got in the lookbook, but you'll be able to adapt these and have your own ideas for your class. But let me just give you some examples. So the first one we said was making sure we prioritize communication over tiny mistakes or errors, for example. And we can do this by connecting tasks with their real life and making them realize how they communicate in real life. So what we have here, I mean, you won't be able to see the absolute detail, but just to give you a rough idea, is we're looking at one of the flyers speaking tasks. And what the students have to do here is the examiner has a card and the student has a card. And basically, they're asking each other questions to find out the answers. So they take it in turns. Very, very daunting for some students because they have to initiate, they have to ask the questions. But rather than them worrying about, have I said the right word? Have I got my tense right? We can help them with realizing that this task is actually basically something that they do every day. So around this, when we're practicing this, we can have an activity where this particular task was asking about something at the weekend. You can ask your students, not looking at the task at all, just in their own life, to think of 5 questions they might ask someone about an activity at the weekend. So, for example, doubtless they all come to school on Monday morning, and some of them will have been on a picnic or to a museum or something, and they can think, well, you see your friend on Monday morning and you know he's been somewhere nice. What questions do you normally ask him? And they can see, then they should be able to see, as I say, that the exam is not asking them to do strange or peculiar things with the language. It's just following a sort of logical communication that you would have with your friend on Monday morning to ask them about the weekend. And then we can praise them for getting that communicative exchange right, even if they've made some mistakes. Let's just move on to the next one, where we said this one was about making learners aware of how they use their first language and how much they can transfer when they're speaking in a second language using what they know. Now, what we have here is a similar task. It's also that it's presented slightly differently, but it's a similar task where they have to ask and answer questions, because here what they're going to do is they're looking forward, they're making a plan for the weekend. And so again, what you can ask them to do is, without looking at the task, you can just say to them in pairs. So imagine you're going to make an arrangement to do something with your friend at the weekend. What questions would you ask them to make that arrangement? And they can all think of this because they must do this the whole time, even if they're quite young. What do you want to do? What time do you want to do it? Why do you like that? And then you can point out to them the kind of exchanges they have in their first language, which can also help them with communication, this communicative task in their second language, which is not just about the timing, but perhaps they've got to persuade the other person to do something. They've got to say why it's nice, or they've got to finally somehow reach a conclusion. They've got to reach an agreement. And that's something that they are all aware of how they can do in their own language. And if you're communicating, they should be able to use these ideas for English as well. And then what about collaboration? So here we've got another example from the Movers speaking exam. And in this is quite a common activity anyway. They've got two pictures with some differences, and basically they've got to find the differences and explain what the differences are in a kind of comparison. And students can get very worried about this because they feel they need to know a lot of the vocabulary. So this is an ideal task to let them work collaboratively. Remember, I said to give them a safe space to think about all the things they need to think about and what they're going to do. So you can ask them. They don't have to be in pairs. Maybe they can be more than pairs. First of all, they find the differences, which are normally relatively easy to find. Then they have to talk to each other about what those differences are. They might start off saying things like, oh, blonde hair and dark hair, but then you want to encourage them to communicate, to talk in full sentences. How would they describe that difference? And they can sit together and work that out with each other. Even if they don't get it quite right, it's worthy if they manage to say a longer stretch of speech to talk about the differences. And those will slowly increase their confidence. And as well, their friend might know something they don't know, so they can learn from their classmates as well. And quite often, if you do an activity like this with them, because they've done it with a friend or friends, it also, they remember it. It helps their memory as well. And then the last one, which, as I say, we've touched on before, but, let's have a look at this. We've said that it's very important that they have time to reflect on what they've done and improve. And so what I would suggest here, and again, we've got some ideas in the book that you can copy or adapt, is let's, for example, say like here, they've got a writing task that they've got to do that they're going to be assessed on. And so you can ask them to do the task and then give them a very, very easy checklist for them to go back and look at what they've done. So, for example, is my writing easy to read? Or are there some letters that are quite difficult? Are my grammar and spelling correct? And you can show them to make sure they've copied spelling correctly, that they've used the grammar in the questions to help them with the grammar in their answers. And importantly for this one, it's, did I write 2 new sentences? Have I given new information? Now, you can ask them to think about this. They can do it individually or they can do it as a kind of peer assessment. And when they've found out, if they've done something wrong, so they might say, oh, no, actually, some of my writing is not very easy to read, or my partner says it's not easy to read, then ask them to think about what they can do to make that better. And so, for example, you might say to them or encourage them to think about, okay, I'm going to write a little bit more slowly and be more careful. I'm not going to rush. And so once they've understood that for each of those points, then you can ask them to do the task again, and they'll do it much more successfully, and they'll have a nice time, they'll have a nice opportunity to have a successful achievement of the task. Some of you, I know you're all we're racing through curricula, most of us, through the year, and I know that time is an issue, but I would honestly advise you to set aside some time for this, because you might find, I'm sure you will find, that their progress is faster if they can correct themselves like this, rather than you endlessly having to repeat stuff. So it's worth having a little experiment with that. So there, we've looked at the challenges that we think the students are having, and some ideas for how we can help them feel more comfortable going into the exam and appreciating it's communicative. So let's move on now to thinking about us as teachers, and what we want to understand about what we're assessing. So I want you to just put your ideas in the chat box about this. If you're looking at your students speaking, what kind of things, what do we want to assess? What's important? You know, a lot of exam boards and tests do things differently, but actually we all end up with very similar ideas of what we're assessing. So what do you think is important? What do we usually want to assess when we're I'm just going to let you write a bit there. Yes, there's a lot of people writing fluency. And a lot of people writing communicative skills, but of course we've got to break that down into something that we can measure. And fluency and communication are quite difficult to define, so we have to think about the elements that make up fluency and communication so that we can understand it and explain it to our students. Okay, there's a lot of nice ideas there, so I think if you'd like to finish typing now, and then we'll look at this together. So normally, as I said, things vary, but normally when we're looking at assessing speaking, there might be 3 broad criteria that we're looking at. And the first one of these is task fulfillment. And this is basically, did the student answer the question? Did they follow the instructions? And this is arguably the most important criteria, because if the student doesn't do the task, then quite often the examiner can't mark what they've done. So it's and some students think, oh, I'll just say what I know. And I'm afraid that's not how they're going to get very good scores. They do need to make sure they answer the question. And it's very important, especially with young learners, we get them to focus on this. So how can we do that? Well, one idea is you could record, maybe on your phone or something, what we might call some relevant and irrelevant samples. So for example, you could take a very simple question that they might be asked in the exam, like, do you like tennis? And you could record 2 or 3 different answers, and one of your answers would be, yes, I love tennis, etc., etc. And another answer might be, I play tennis on Mondays, and so on. So you can give them a lot of different examples and ask them to judge whether or not it answers the question. And that is, if you ask them to do the judgment, they will begin to understand it much more. And if you've got stronger learners or higher level, you might even want to give them 3 or 4 examples and ask them to put them in order of how relevant they are, how strongly they answer the question. So that's one feature. Something else which is very important is coherence. And cohesion is part of this. And this is, did what the student said make sense? Now, again, this is an important focus for the communicative skills, because here we're not saying, oh, did you get your past tense correct? But did, the overall, what you said, even if you had some mistakes, did it make sense? Or did you get the word order in a mess so that we didn't understand? An example of something like this is to help your students focus on the important words in a sentence, the things they need to focus on. And quite often it's not what you'd expect. It's not necessarily the nouns, which is where we already know what we're talking about. It's things like pronouns. Did he do it or did she do it, or was it an it? So when we're thinking about the students making sense, it's important they realize that the features that go towards making sense. As I say, that's not always accuracy. Sometimes it's about the building of the communication. And then finally, when we're talking about speaking, of course, we want to talk about intelligibility. And obviously, English is a global language nowadays. There's lots of varieties of pronunciation. So often, this doesn't usually hinge on absolutely correct detail of pronunciation. It's about, were you understandable? And quite often, the reason a student is unintelligible is because they're speaking too quickly, or they've got the stress in the wrong place. So, for example, if Spanish is your first language, you speak very quickly. Spanish and Japanese are the two fastest languages. And if you do that in English, it can become sometimes quite hard to understand, not because you're mispronouncing, but you're running the words together and you're speaking too quickly. So we need to focus here. We need to make sure that the student understands not to get into a panic about have they pronounced a vowel correctly, but are they overall understandable? Do they need to slow down? Okay. So let's move on and think for the same for writing. What about writing? When we ask students to do some writing, again, do you want to put some little ideas in the chat box of what do we normally assess when we assess writing? Is it the same or different? What sort of things are we trying to assess? What do you think do you normally assess when we're assessing writing? Okay, so some of you have put content, structure, originality. That's quite a difficult one to measure. Coherence, yes, is important. Couple of you still saying accuracy. Okay, well, let's have a look at this together. You can stop in the chat box now, but you've got all your ideas there that you can see from your colleagues. So again, writing is very similar. Often it falls into three broad categories. Did the student follow the instructions? Did they write what they were supposed to write? And again, here, you can give the students practice in not just in the topic focus, in what they're writing about, but also how much to write is often important. Have they written enough? Young learners sometimes don't write enough. So have they written enough to follow the instructions and fulfill the task as it's required? So, and this is all about how much communication they're giving. So you can give them some practice in that and show them, to try and show them which of the criteria are important. And again, coherence is important. Does the writing make sense? And here you want to use ideas that you've got to showing your students, helping your students how to go back and check their work. Have they missed an important word out? Have they put things in the wrong order? And again, this is much more not about the minutiae of have they done the correct grammar ending, but have they put in all those important reference words or made clear when it's a question. And finally, again, intelligibility. Now, of course, intelligibility in writing is, was the writing clear and easy to read? So again, you want to give them activities to make sure that what they're writing is very clear, because it's no good them answering the question and doing it all sort of wonderfully and fantastically if the examiner can't read their writing. So they need to make sure that they spend some time on this. And obviously, it's important for young learners because often they're still learning to write in their own language. Okay. So notice here, I've really steered away from the detail of, the tiny bits of grammar or pronunciation. And we're very much focused on communication and the broader picture so that they don't sort of panic about whether things are right. So let's go through some ideas now. So we've looked at what we're assessing. So how can we use those criterion to help the students? Well, something again I spoke about in the last webinar, but it's worth reiterating here, is if you've got 3 or 4 criteria with young learners, it's very important to just focus on one thing at a time. So just task fulfillment or just coherence. So just let them get to grips with one criterion at a time, because otherwise it's too much. It's too, they get too confused, okay? And, as you're doing that, then with your one criterion, as I say, what you can do is record 2 or 3 versions of the same task, which you've done differently. Maybe one is coherent, one's not coherent, and one is in the middle. But ask the students to judge. What's their judgment? How good is the answer according to that criterion? And that helps them really, really understand it. And they can see the effect because they're listening to it. They can see the effect of if it's in a muddle, what it sounds like. So this is a way to really get them involved, is to get them to do the judging. And then also, if you're focusing on one criterion, you can give them activities to make sure, to help them understand. So say we're looking at task fulfillments, you might ask them to do an activity and to judge with each other. How many words can you get that are on task? You might want to give them the words. You might, give them a picture of a tennis racket and say they've got to speak about, do they like tennis or do they play tennis? You could give them a lot of verbs. You could give them play, go, do like, don't like. You can give them some nouns like tennis, park, friend, etc. and see how many words they can use that they can get on task, or ask them to think of the words. Have a game of who can make the longest sentence using lots of words. And again, give them examples of what's wrong. If you're doing intelligibility, what's wrong in sentences? Give them examples of where the stress is wrong and see if they can spot it. So this is all about making them the judges, but also focusing them by pushing them to give, more complete answers and recognizing that they have the language to do that. And again, it's the same if we look at writing, we can take the same approach. So again, I would say make sure you only focus on one criterion at a time. As you go through the course or the year or the term, you can start bringing the criterion together when you're happy they understand them, fully, individually. And again, for this one, you can write some samples. You can write lots of different samples covering the points in your criterion. So you might have some in good writing, some in bad writing, some in, where some words are wrong, and ask the students to judge. Make them decide what is good and what is not so good and what is problematic. And the same, you can have little mini tasks to help make sure that they know, they know that they've got to sort of give a lot of information usually, rather than they're sitting there struggling, worrying about what to do. So, for writing, you can ask them to look at a single picture and to write down how many verbs can you get out of that picture, how many nouns, nouns, ask higher levels to do paraphrasing, and then ask them to write sentences using 2 verbs and 3 of the nouns, for example. Or again, get them to do wrong sentences and either to correct them or to spot what the problem is. So you can have some mini tasks there that focus, and the focus there is on them understanding how they're being assessed. Understanding, remember we said at the beginning, many students don't understand what they're being judged on and they panic it's about their mistakes. And here we're trying to alter their focus, make them more aware of what they're actually being assessed on in the exam. So we imagine that we've we've put our students at ease and we've taught them about criteria and they're doing their task and they've completed their task. And then of course the next thing that we want to move on to is giving our students feedback. Now, feedback is something which people spend a different amount of time on that isn't always covered in teacher training courses. So let's have a look at it. The first thing I want you to do is to do a little poll for me and look at the ideas there and just tick what you usually do. Which ones of those? You can tick more than one. What do you normally do out of that list? Let's see generally what we do for feedback. I'll just give you a little bit more time to tick. As I say, you can tick more than one, but be honest. Okay, let's stop the poll there, shall we, and have a look at what's going on there. So we can see that what most of you do, a lot of the time, is you give class feedback. Okay, I imagine you do. A lot of you do that, especially because of time. So you're giving class feedback, so that's great. And then what seems to be equally popular is you give individual feedback, which is fantastic. If you've got the time to do that, that's great. And you mark errors on written work, which I'm going to say something about. Then a slightly smaller portion of you manage to give immediate feedback. And hardly any of you do the last one, which is agree the focus for the feedback with the class. So of course I'm going to reverse things because I'm going to go backwards on that. And the thing that very few of you do, I'm going to say is the most important thing. But I hope what I'd like you to take away today, just thinking there about what you've said, some of you have said about errors on the written work, is remember what we said is the focus is often, it's not always, but it's often on have they communicated and how well have they communicated. So you might not always want to use this sort of focusing on the errors idea, because that feeds into them. They think, oh, that's what matters, and that's when they panic in the exam. So you want to give equal weight to communication sometimes. So let me tell you my ideas about feedback, because this is something I'm very interested in. I've spent quite a lot of time on. So the first thing is the thing that you had last on the poll. And I think, especially with speaking, with young learners, it's very important that you depersonalize the feedback you give them, because you know what happens if somebody gives you feedback, and especially if it's on your spoken language, you think it's about you forget it's about the language, and you think that somebody is criticizing you or shaming you personally, and then you don't want to hear the feedback. And our young learners tend to do this. So we've got to think, how can we depersonalize it? Now, one way of doing it is to work with the objectives, that the aims that you've got and what the students understand, and agree the feedback with them. And the way you can do this is to say, right, what our objective was today, what we were focusing on today was, were we being intelligible when we were talking? And before you begin the task, you can say to them, especially if you've done the work on criteria, so what matters there? What are we going to think about? And they can say, oh, how fast I speak or where I stress. You can even write that on the board. Then after they've done the task, when you give them the feedback, they can see that this is about what's been agreed generally, that it's not personal to them. And so I think it's very important to include your learners in the process of feedback and not make it one way from teacher to student, but include the students in it. I'm going to start speaking quickly now because I've just noticed the time. So now the other thing is timing, which was on that list, which is, when do you give feedback? Now, obviously, it can be very difficult to give immediate feedback, but I would say if you can, for speaking, it's really quite important, because speaking is ephemeral, it's gone, the students have forgotten about it. So if you can, it's quite important to give immediate feedback for speaking. Obviously, for writing, maybe you want to collect your 30 pieces of writing, go home and mark it at the weekend. Maybe the students get it back a week later. If they're young learners, they might have forgotten about it. And so what you can do here is sometimes just flick through the writing as you pick it up and just give them some very immediate, quick class feedback and say, oh, I notice you've all done quite well at this, but it looks like some of you are doing this. So that's what I'm going to look at, just so they get some, some idea of how they've done. Now, the other thing that's critical with young learners is not to overload them. And so try not to muddle too much feedback. Choose a single thing to give them feedback on. So even if you feel there are 2 or 3 things wrong with what they've done, try and be patient and just focus on one thing and give them an opportunity, because otherwise they switch off. It's too much information. And we want to obviously help them work towards autonomous learning and having their own assessment. And so when you've told them what one of the problems is, you can give them a bit of time, allow them, even in groups, to think about why something is wrong, or why was something too short. What did they think? What did they do that made it like that? Give them an opportunity to start thinking of their own ideas of why something went wrong. Again, if you want to depersonalize things and show them, how to be objective, you can write some examples or some rubbish examples and ask them to give feedback on the examples, because this engages them and it shows them they have some control over the process, and it's not just you, they can do it as well. And coming back to our point about a single focus, it's very important. So you've told them what one of the issues is. And also you want to give them one idea of how they can improve that. Don't muddle them up with vagueness and lots of ideas. So try and keep this really tight. There's one issue and this is what you can do to improve it. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that quickly. Give them the opportunity to do the task again, and then give them more feedback so they're not doing it in a vacuum. And finally, which it looks like most of you do, of course, it's important to vary the feedback you give. So sometimes give class feedback, sometimes individual, sometimes you can give group feedback, just so that they're getting the full mix and they learn to understand how important this is in their learning, because it's something that's always going to happen for them. So let's just look, just to finish, at some examples of how we can individualize it. So what I've got on the slide here, and obviously you'll get copies of the slides, is when we're giving feedback on speaking, this is just some examples. The questions that I've put up there are questions you should ask yourself as a teacher before you give feedback. Oops, sorry, get rid of that on my computer. What do you expect? How can the students improve? How will you check? And importantly, how are you consistent and fair, not just in your assessment, but in the feedback you give? And one way is by keeping a log for students. So everybody's got the objective information, and you can make your own log. In the lookbooks, we give you a little template that you can use, but this is how you can use it. So you can see your objective there is what you want the student to do. One of the objectives for your class is respond to simple questions. So you give them a little assessment of that, and you find out that they're getting very mixed up between what and when and why and which. And so the feedback you give them, remember, it's a single feedback with a single solution, is you say, look, listen more carefully to the differences between the questions next time you do it. So you give them a chance to do that, and then they can do another assessment, and you see how they do. And you've got a record of what you've told them, so that you know that you're being consistent between your students, and for each student you're giving different information. And let's just have a look at that. So this is an example of writing. So again, I put the questions that you would ask yourself there to make sure you answer those questions before you launch into feedback. And again, you've got a little log. Your objective is you want students to write about their free time. You give them a little assessment writing task, and you find that they've used the same verb all the time. So you give them the feedback. You need to use more verbs which are different, and then you can tell them how they can learn that and do that. And then you give them the second assessment. So the ABC there is just how successfully they would have done the assessments. This is a little classroom assessment activity that we're using. I've only snapped out an example there, but there's a bit more explanation in the book for you. And I don't know, perhaps if some of you are interested, we could do a fuller webinar on feedback, because there's a lot to say about it. So just to finish, let's just look at the next steps, and these are my next steps for you. And as I say, what I'd like you to take away from this is make sure you agree with your learners what that feedback is what kind of feedback you're going to give. And make sure you brainstorm the assessment criteria with the class so it becomes very familiar. One idea is you can even give code words for each criteria, so you haven't got these big mouthfuls every time. And another idea is what you can end up with is a little game of assessment bingo, where you create little bingo cards with the criteria, task fulfillment, intelligibility, etc. And you read out examples, and they have to say which one each criteria is doing, or what grade they would give it. I should have a little example of that for you, but I'm afraid time's running on. So I think we are going to I'm going to finish my section now and hand you back to Emily. But thank you all very much for participating, for your interesting ideas.
All right. Thank you so much, Elaine. Thank you all for joining. Let's just turn my video on quickly now. Just a few final notes as we wrap up here. So many of the examples Elaine used today were from Look, which is the new 7-level series for young learners of English. Look gives young learners the core language, balance skills, foundation, and confidence-boosting exam support they need to be successful in the 21st century. If you're interested in learning more about Look, I'm going to put the link in here, and we'll also include it in the follow-up email to you. Speaking of the follow-up email, we will be sending one. It will include a certificate of attendance for you, the recording, as well as the slides like Elaine mentioned. That should come in about 5 business days, so just stay tuned for that. And if you did enjoy today's session, we'd love for you to come back. I know many of you were returning webinar viewers, but we're so glad this community exists for teachers of English. So definitely be sure to register on our website for some more of our sessions if you're interested. You can also subscribe to email notifications to be notified of new webinars there too. We do have an In Focus blog for teachers. Elaine is a contributor to that blog, and we'll be doing a follow-up post about this webinar. So thanks all for joining. Hope you connect with us on social and have a great rest of your morning, evening, afternoon, whatever time it is where you are. Take care. I'm going to send you all to a quick follow-up survey now. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you.